But I think, with powerful questions, there also has to be the discussion about like, okay, well, how do you make the change?
I truly believe the quality of our life is in direct connection to the quality of questions we ask others and ourselves.
So questions are everything, but how often do we actually sit down, and this is myself included, how often do we sit down and ask ourselves these questions? Why am I doing what I'm doing?
And I think it's the art of the follow-up question. Because often you ask an initial question and then someone will share something. And if you're good at asking questions, hopefully they can then, go on for a little bit in answering it. And somewhere in there, there's a gem of something interesting.
Welcome to the Lunch Break ABCs. We are here to talk about a topic that is near and dear to your heart. And we only know that because you voted on the topic we're talking about today and every other topic we talk about. This is episode Q. And that means we are talking about a question that starts with Q, and that is how to ask better questions to yourself, to others, in your personal life, in your business life. How are questions powerful? Why are we dedicating an hour to talking about questions? Why did you vote on questions when there was many other great topics? Obviously, this is something that's near and dear to your heart, and we're going to cover it today. So welcome to Lunch Break. I'm Brandon Eastman. Christine Smith is right here. Ben Albert's right here. And Andrew Biernat is right here. I hope the layout's the same for everybody. So I'd like to ask you guys just to kick this off, kind of a dual part here. Why do you think so many people, because there was a lot of votes on this, why do you think a lot of people voted on what questions to ask ourselves and others? Why did they vote on that? And why is this topic so important to people, in your opinion?
I'll start. I'll just go quick. So I think the topic of like introspection and kind of discovery very much relates to this kind of phase that we're in right now, and kind of this kind of post-COVID landscape where everything kind of got turned upside down, and people have been doing a lot of reevaluating lately. So in my opinion, it's just kind of invaded the culture and our mindset that we're questioning the norms. We're questioning what has been. We're questioning the way things have always been done. We're questioning, what do I care about? Am I happy? Am I interested in this? Do I like this? Am I making money? I don't know. And we have all these thoughts that are going on. And I think if we can ask better questions, then I think we can get to better results. I think that's why a lot of the audience was interested. But I'm kind of curious for you guys, why do you think the audience was so keyed up on this one?
I was going to say that I think people are actually not good at asking questions, which is probably why a lot of people kind of gravitated to this one. I think we all have a really hard time being uncomfortable. There's like a comfort level when you ask questions, because usually when you're asking questions, there's very specific reasons, right? You don't understand something, you're kind of having an uncomfortable conversation, you're trying to get more information, right? And this can be personally or professionally, good or bad, right? And like questions kind of run every category. And I think a lot of times we ask questions that only yield a yes or no response, like even from like a parent to a child, right? The question we always ask our kids is like, oh, how was school? You always get the answer fine, right? Like, well, that's not a good question. You're asking the wrong question. Instead of saying, well, did you have library today? What was your favorite part about today, right? And I think we have a really hard time in trying to figure out, well, what is the end result? What are we trying to look for? And how do we, phrase a question accordingly so that we can get towards the end goal a lot better? And it may not just be one question. It may be multiple questions to get to that answer. And I think that's something that we have a hard time kind of connecting the dots, because it's not just A to B. Usually it's like A, B, C, D, E, F. And okay, well, what are the steps that we have to take, to get to that point?
Yeah, I feel like not only is it not just A to B, it's A to C to Z to R. It's all over the place. And I truly believe the quality of our life is in direct connection to the quality of questions we ask others and ourselves. And I even think like asking the question, how do I ask better questions, isn't even really the right question. The right question is, how do I become more curious? How do I have this insatious curiosity where it's not always what you say, it's how you say it and how you listen. I actually wrote this down because I read this research study that 6% of communication is asking questions, 60% is response to the question. So it's less and less. First off, you want to ask a good question to get a response. You don't want it to be close ended. You want it to be open ended. But it's less about the question itself. It's about the conversation it creates. Who's been a part of a conversation where someone talks and then the next person says something completely unrelated or doesn't ask a follow-up question? Who's been a part of a sales pitch where you give them exactly what you need and it's like not on their script to go deeper, so they just go in a different direction. It has nothing to do with what you just told them. It's icky and it's weird. 60% of communication is just responding to the question. So the question I like to ask myself is, how can I be more curious? If I'm more curious, better questions will occur. But it's like, I think the beauty's in the follow-up. And the follow-up doesn't happen without the listening. And the listening doesn't happen unless you actually care. So how do we optimize for actually caring? I don't know if we can talk about that on this short call. But more curious we become, the more authentic the questions are and the easier it is to ask the right questions, because a curious question doesn't have a yes or no answer. A curious question has an open-ended answer, and then you listen and then you learn.
And to your point, the most interesting people that I've met, and usually the most interesting is synonymous with the most successful, not always, but a lot of the time, those are people who are extremely curious people, right? Very curious. They want to know about you. They ask a lot of questions. You tell them something they're not familiar with, and they don't just say, oh, okay, yeah, that's cool. But they're like, oh, really? Like, tell me more about that. Like in sales, like every day I'll ask people what they do for work, and they tell me, and I'm like, what does that look like? Like they tell me that they're a software engineer at this company, and it's like, okay, well, what's a day-to-day look like? Like, what's a day in your life? Can you guide me through it? Like, what are you actually doing? What are your actionables? And it gets people talking, right? And when you get other people talking about them, it in turn makes you more interesting. Not that that's the reason you're doing it, right? And that goes to the whole optimize for caring message. But recently, I just read a poll this morning, and I wish I had the guy's name who posted it on LinkedIn. I don't know him personally, but he's a big LinkedIn influencer. Thousands and thousands of votes on this poll. And the question was, are you happy and excited to wake up and go to work? Or do you wake up and you're not excited and happy to go to work? And over 60% of people said that they wake up and they're not excited to go to work. And it causes us to then ask questions. Why did I choose, no, I'm not excited? What is it about what I do that is causing me not to be excited? What can I do different that can help me be more excited at work? Or maybe the question is it work that's causing me not to be excited? Or is it just the fact that I'm not excited? Is it something that I can do differently? Like in sales, and I always reference that because that's my world. I've been in it since I was 18, so over 12 years now. In sales, questions are everything. Like we have a sales process called Sell with Class. Class is an acronym. We love acronyms here. Make contact, that's the first C. Listen, advise, solve, and secure. And the second step there, but really it's the first step because making contact is, hey, Ben, nice to meet you. I'm Brandon. Let me take you to my desk. So L is listen. And listen, in order to listen, you got to ask questions, right? Unless someone's just an insatiable talker. So we ask people questions. Like we have a whole structure of fun, family, work, life. Like ask people questions about them. But it's you can't necessarily ask questions unless you care. It's like listening to a podcast host who doesn't care. Usually you don't listen to podcast hosts who don't care because you don't listen to those podcasts and they don't last a very long time. Like when you listen to Ben's show, like Ben has very interesting people on. And even when we went to that sushi restaurant, Ben, like you're talking about what you want to ask it was the woman who was in the cult. You're like, what should I ask? What can we talk about? Because you're just naturally a curious person. So questions are everything, but how often do we actually sit down? And this is myself included. How often do we sit down and ask ourselves these questions? You know, why am I doing what I'm doing? What's going well? What's not going well? What can I change to get a different result? I think so many people voted on this because we know that we can ask ourselves more questions, but it's not even asking ourselves more. It's how can we, like you said, Ben, how can we optimize the questions we're asking to make them better, to get better results? So maybe like, what are some amazing questions? Like, what are some questions you guys ask yourself, maybe on a frequent basis? What's a question that you've asked yourself that has helped to bring more alignment and more clarity to what it is you're doing? Maybe we have some examples of those, or we can take it anywhere.
I can quickly give one. I ask myself this question all the time. 2024 is the year of intention, and it's the year of no. I'm very agreeable. I don't say no much. I'm learning how to do it. And I ask myself this question: is this in direct alignment with who I am becoming? There's a lot that went on the back end there. I know my values, I know my goals, I know who I want to become, I know who I am and what I'm capable of. So when Brandon asks me, hey, would you like to come do this, or that, I just simply ask myself the question, is this in alignment with who I am becoming? Now, the real work was determining what I valued. But once I did, it's as simple as, if it's not a heck yes, then it's a no. If this is in alignment with my mission, heck yes. If it's not, brilliant. I'm so excited that you asked me, but I want to defer to someone else that can better fit this need. So that's my one question this year. Is this in alignment with who I am and who I am becoming?
So how has that helped you so far, asking that? Like, is there an example of you asking yourself that and saying no to something or saying yes to something else?
Yeah, well, I just spoke at SUNY Brockport, the school I went to, and I didn't get paid to be there. We got grabbed lunch. I spent 2.5 hours out of my Friday to do it. But one of my missions is really to get the wisdom from people who have it to people who need it. And the people that need it most and will create the most ripples are our youth. So what better place to talk for free than a college of people that paid to be there, are in that class and want to learn? So that's in direct alignment. But there was a podcast, and I'm not going to say it out loud, but there's a podcast recently that I said no to. And there was a time where I didn't say no to any podcast, but it just wasn't a good fit. And I knew that I'd have to pretend like I knew what I was talking about, which I can do, but I didn't want to pretend. It wasn't in alignment with my mission, so I didn't get in a podcast that I wasn't an expert in. It's really that simple.
Is that why you said no to me?
You never asked. You never asked.
All right, guys, have a good day. That's a great example, though, man. The fact that you weren't getting paid for it, right? But you know that will lead to other opportunities. It's an opportunity to help the people there because you know it aligns with what you're doing. I love that.
Yeah. Any other questions, guys?
I don't really have a question. I mean, I think the alignment thing is, to me, that's boundaries. Like, is this within my boundaries that I've been trying to set and stick to? Is this in line with, the direction that I want to go? The Marie Kondo thing, does it give me happiness? Is it something I'm going to use? But I think the other thing too is, I think what's hard about asking questions, especially if you're doing it from an internal perspective, is if you don't have an answer. Even if you're asking yourself good questions, like if we're using if you're not happy about something like a relationship, a job, the direction that your life is going right now, and yeah, you have that answer, right? Okay, I'm not happy. Okay, well, why? Well, because it's a job. Okay, well, why? Because of this, right? And you can keep going down that line. But I think, with powerful questions, there also has to be the discussion about like, okay, well, how do you make the change, right? Like, that's a question in itself. Well, how am I going to change this? Who do I need to call? What are the resources that I have available? And maybe those are the next step, right? Okay, this is the issue, right? Just like what we do for the client. Okay, what is the problem? Okay, how do we get to that next direction? Okay, here's the solution that can be provided. Here's what the execution is going to look like. Okay, here's the potential result. And I think it's hard to look at something, especially if it requires a drastic change, or if it requires a hard change. It's going to hurt feelings, or it's challenging for yourself. It's going to make you uncomfortable. And that's not something you're used to doing, right? So you'll continue asking yourself those questions with the same answer. But again, it's like, okay, well, you're not making the change. So either a different question has to be asked, or you need to incorporate people who can help you get over that hump.
One question that I've been asking a lot is related to one that I actually made fun of a lot when I was in high school. And I had a teacher, physics teacher, and he would often just pause and say, "Does that make sense?" And he just said it in such a weird way that like it's really just like kind of like stood out. And it was funny. My buddy and I would just like start looking at each other, and like we started making tally marks over the course of the year. I mean, he asked the question like almost every day, at least once or twice. And so we had this like huge tally list by the end of the year. But and I was always like, oh, it's so cheesy, so dorky. But now in my professional life, I do a lot of coaching, and it's a lot of consultative, but also exploration-based work where I'm trying to give people some advice and kind of help them make something better, but also kind of figure out what they're thinking, what's going on, how do we peel the layers back on this. And so often I'll find myself once in a while getting kind of excited about something and kind of sharing a bunch on something. And then, I have to kind of stop myself and say, okay, cool. I've said my piece. I now need to create some space. I need to create some verbal space for us so that I can hear more about what's going on for them. And so I'll literally say, hey, I want to pause for a second. I know I just said a whole bunch right there. I want to create a little space for a second. What's going on in your mind right now? Well, based on what we just talked about, anything coming up for you right now? And I'll just pause like that and ask a question like that. And sometimes it's like, nope, nothing there. Cool, let's keep going. And then I can keep explaining something or go into something else or ask another question. But oftentimes people will be like, well, and now we can get into like their objection. We can get into a challenge that they have. We can get into something interesting that's coming up for them that if I had just kept steamrolling or asked a different question, that may have never come up. And often, with my coaching, if something doesn't get solved on this call, it stays until the next call, right? It doesn't magically resolve itself. And so if there was something getting in the way of their productivity or getting something done or doing something they needed to do, and that didn't come out on this call, guess what? They're not going to get anything done. And we're going to have another call, and we're going to be back to that spot where I could have just created that space, found out what the real objection was or challenge was, and we could have solved that together. And so I think just creating verbal space for people with your questions, especially if you're in an expert-based position, that can be extremely helpful to kind of just draw them in to get more insight. Half the time, they're going to say, no, I got nothing. Let's keep going. But the other half, you're going to find something very interesting that you can dig into.
Super important. I was at a conference last year, and at the very end of the conference, I was in the back of the room with my books, and people were coming up, and I was signing books. And this really nice lady who's been in sales for over 20 years came up to me. And I said, hey, what are your wins recently? How are you feeling about what you're doing with this company? Just like I was asking everybody. And she said, I'm not doing too well. She said, I feel that I've been in a downward slump. I don't know how to get back to where I was. And she said a few more things. And I said, well, what's going on? And she said, well, I lost my son last year. And ever since then, nothing's been the same. I haven't been able to get back to where I was before that. And I thought to myself, ooh, this is one of those situations, right? So it's very important when I come back with an ask or say. So something just popped into my head. It wasn't from me. I think it was from whatever else. It just popped into my head where I said, well, who says that you have to go back to who you were before? Are you the same person now that you were before? Because if you're not, it's going to be really, really hard to get back to that place, right? And she said, wow, I never really thought about that. And I said, well, who are you now and who do you want to be? Right. So we went from looking at the past to looking at the present a little bit, but really looking towards the future and who do you want to be? And I think this is applicable to a lot of people. And I think this is why 60% of people wrote that they're not happy when they wake up to go to work because they're still operating from a framework of who they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Some people who've been with the same company for 20, 30 years, maybe the same role for 30 years, might be thinking, I'm just not happy anymore doing this. I was at the beginning, but not anymore. So I ask you the question, are you the same person you are now as you used to be? Right? The answer is no. No one's going to say yes to that question. I haven't met someone yet. So how must you change now in order to fit onto that Marie Kondo happiness scale, right? With whatever happiness means to you. How must you change now in order to become the new version of you? And what does that new version of you do different than what you did back then? Because every single day is a new day to reinvent yourself. Every single day is a new day to do what you're doing, Ben. Is this in alignment with what I want? Is this in alignment with who I am? but you don't know if those things are in alignment unless you ask yourself the question, who am I? What is in alignment? And what is it that I want? I think the biggest thing ever when it comes to asking questions is you have to have a preface of, what do I want? That's one of the biggest questions. Maybe even the adverse of that, what don't I want? Because if you know what you don't want, it makes it really easy to determine what it is you do want.
Real quick, what's coming to my mind is if it's that difficult, and it is very difficult, we could do 10 days on this. If it's that difficult to ask the right questions of yourself and figure out what you want, why do you think it's any easier for all the people you meet? So to assume you know who they are, what they want, their goals, their objectives, if you didn't ask a couple questions, you might have never known, Brandon, that they had just had a passing in their life. And if it's that difficult to figure ourselves out, why are we assuming we figured other people out? So that's where questions come into a play. I mean, I can make assumptions based on the clothing or the hair, or I can make assumptions, but you really will never understand someone fully unless you ask those similar questions to them as well.
Isn't it interesting how we can offer advice to other people so easily and so freely, especially everyone listening to this right now? You're the type of person who people come to you for advice. It's just guaranteed. But when it comes time to give ourselves advice, one of the most powerful questions I found, and I do not practice what I preach a lot of the time, but I do my best, is if I was someone I was coaching, what advice would I give that person, right? Dissociate that person as yourself. What advice would I give myself if I was coaching myself? And it's incredible. It's like you're literally unlocking the floodgates when you ask yourself that question, and all the ideas come pouring in as if you were coaching yourself. Imagine if we took a few minutes each day to coach ourselves. Imagine what our life would look like and how we'd feel if we did that.
Imagine's a good word. Just imagine puts you in a state of imagination, of curiosity, of questioning. Because is it fair to say that this world is very beautiful and confusing, and sometimes it's suffering? We live in a crazy world. I feel like we're never going to run out of questions to ask. Mother Earth is an interesting beast.
As long as we stay curious, right?
So how do you stay curious? Like, are you guys all naturally curious people, or have you learned how to be curious? Is it something that came to you innately?
I think it's hard. Like, I can tell you, like, there are some times where, like talking to your client about whatever, right? And you get an answer to something, and I don't always think about like asking another question. Like, sometimes it's easy to, but there are sometimes you can't always do that. Like, it's not easy to just ask another question to get to a deeper layer or, get more information. And sometimes I feel like, especially if I'm very focused on something, I'm trying to get a specific answer, and that's a stopping point, and then we're going to the next thing, right? Rather than diving a little bit deeper. And it's very challenging to kind of like going back to what Ben was mentioning, like the listening aspect, but being mindful of, who you're in the room with, what the goal is of that conversation, if there is a goal, and just being more mindful. It's super hard, like to be in the moment and be like, oh, I should probably ask another question. Or, especially if someone responds, right? You ask them like how they're doing, and they have like a run-on sentence, and you respond to probably a piece of that. And then you may not come back to the rest of it, right? And sometimes I feel bad about that. I do that in text messages too. Like, I'll respond to something and I'm like, oh, I should have probably responded to this other piece as well. I hope they didn't think that I didn't read that or whatever, but my brain is already 3 steps ahead of, how to respond.
So we have a comment from Larry Livingston. Larry, thanks for joining. He says, besides Ben, I missed who are the panelists. Larry, I threw our names right here. So I'm Brandon, Ben, Christine, Andrew. So I'll keep the names up for everyone who's tuning in after. Hey, let us know in the comments. What are your thoughts on the best questions to ask yourself and others? Why do you think questions matter? One thing I'd like to ask you guys when it comes to questions is, Can questioning be a bad thing? And I speak from experience with this. Sometimes when I'm presented with a new opportunity or someone who I don't really know that well comes out of the woodworks and offers me an opportunity or offers me a product or an event, anything, I'm a very skeptical person. And some of the most successful people I've met aren't very skeptical. Like they do their due diligence as much as possible, but they're willing to jump into new opportunities. But I find myself questioning things a lot. So is skepticism good when it comes to question asking? Like, are you guys skeptical? Am I alone? What are your thoughts there?
I mean, definitely. Like, I feel like a little kid in the sense of like, oh, I believe everyone's good and amazing, right? And then the other part of me is like, wait, is this legit? Is this for real, right? And this is, meeting somebody new or, having those deeper conversations. But I think skepticism is important because I think it causes you to ask more questions and be more curious. But I think you could also say that skepticism is like, there's a different word. Like skepticism is very negative, right? But I think that could be flipped into like a positive side and saying like, I'm not entirely sure. I need more information. So, I guess using curious as maybe the better word, like, oh, I'm just more curious. I need more information before I can determine any sort of future relationship, a sale, what resources I need to share, connections I need to share. I think that may be like, a better spin for that.
Yeah, I'm not going to read it all, but one word that keeps popping up when I Google definitions is the word doubt. And skeptical has just asking the question, like, what is the meaning behind the words? I think the meaning doesn't matter. It really just the meaning you give to it. But is being skeptical and doubtful good? If we're being literal, is being doubtful good? Probably not. But is reserving the right to do some additional research or be curious? Definitely, probably. So yeah, I think there's an underlying thing in the word skepticism. Like he's a skeptic. He doesn't believe anything. I don't know. I think it could be a good or bad thing.
I think it's two sides of the same thing. Being curious and being skeptical is just the mood. You know what I mean? If you're more positive about it, you're curious. If you're more negative about it, you're skeptical, but you're still asking questions. Because when you're skeptical, you're kind of probing for weakness and like, where's the scam? What's going on? When you're curious, you're just excited and exuberant and kind of asking some of the same things. So I think they really go hand in hand, and it just kind of depends on if any of your gut instinct has been triggered. And I think in a lot of ways that kind of depends on how you were approached or the questions that were asked of you. And that may kind of bring up certain red flags to bring on more skepticism. But yeah, I think they're very much related.
I just looked up where skepticism derives from, and it derives from the ancient Greeks, where they called it skeptikos, which means thoughtful or inquiring, which is very interesting. So let me tell you about a time in my life where I was asking myself a lot of questions, and there's one thing that helped me to really solidify those answers for myself. And I don't do this as much anymore because I write so much down for the podcast. I'm writing so much down for content ideas, all these things. So I don't take as much time anymore to sit with myself, and I should. And I think we all can say that we should, right? But maybe creating a plan of 10 minutes every single morning. Tony Robbins says, if you don't have 10 minutes, you don't have a life, right? So how can I give myself 10 minutes to do what I'm about to say? But I used to take my journal every single morning, and it wasn't this is a notebook, but I've got like a nice leather bound journal. It's upstairs. I probably haven't written in it in like over a month, but I used to write down what I'm grateful for, right? And I used to ask quite possibly the most powerful question you can ask, which is, what am I grateful for in my life right now? And I had a challenge for myself where I'd write down 10 things every single morning that I was grateful for. And the book I read that gave me this idea is The Magic by Rhonda Byrne. Excellent book. And she said, don't just write down what you're grateful for, but see it in your mind, right? Sit there and look at what you just wrote down. I'm so grateful for this show where I get to hang out with Ben, Andrew, and Christine and answer your guys' questions and talk about a topic that's important to you. But she says to see it in your mind's eye. So you're sitting there, you're envisioning and you're imagining the life that you want or the thing that you're grateful for. And it's very interesting when you imagine things. When you imagine something and you're seeing it as a movie playing out in your head, your brain can't differentiate whether that's real life or whether that's imagination, because what's real, right? Is the picture in your mind any different than the picture in the waking world? Is the dream that you had last night that you woke up from and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that seemed like so real. Is that really any less real than the reality that we're living in right now? It's almost as if when we wake up every single day, we're simply rejoining the story that we've been a part of for 30 years, however old you guys are. But what differentiates imagination and dreams except for what we create in our mind, right? So one of the biggest things I did for myself was write down in a journal, and that helped me to really pour the concrete over these ideas, and it really did change the way I felt. And I want to get back to it, and I just have to find a way to incorporate that back into my routine, but I know it could be helpful for a lot of people.
I'm wondering what happened with Christine. The listener might be feeling the same way. We lost Christine. She had an emergency. She had to run off. I just want to address that because she disappeared on us. People are like, where's if they're listening, they're wondering where's Christine, and
she hasn't chimed in a while.
Yeah,
she said, "Does this align with me?" Remove.
Yeah, she started asking the question. See ya.
We helped Christine, which is great.
Oh, love it.
Let me ask you guys in this remaining time, what can we talk about that you believe would be valuable to the person listening when it comes to questions? Maybe it's certain ones we can ask, ones that you've asked, ones that you ask other people who you're interacting with in business, because we've talked a lot of personal. Maybe we transition over to business. Like what are your thoughts? Where can we be of service?
I want to chime in on one. And Ben brought this idea up already. And I think it's the art of the follow-up question. Because often you ask an initial question and then someone will share something. And if you're good at asking questions, hopefully they can, go on for a little bit in answering it. And somewhere in there, there's a gem of something interesting. And often people are humble or they don't realize what's interesting, and to them it's just boring. But what I always try to do is I try and find those little nuggets of intrigue that come out of people's mouths as they're talking. And then instead of just following the logical chain of questions, oh, what do you do for work? Oh, cool. What do you do on your holidays? Okay, blah, blah, blah. Is when someone responds with what I do for work, I'm paying attention to their mood. I'm paying attention to their tone of voice. I'm paying attention to the thing that they just talked about. And I'm trying to find something to connect with. And I'll share an example of this. So Ben, you know this guy, Justin Shank. So he's got a awesome podcast. So I had him on my show, and we got into all kinds of really cool conversations. And at one point, he just kind of offhandedly mentioned the fact that he was bedridden for a lot of his teenage years, and that was, we were in, he kind of that was the middle of something that he was talking about. And then he kind of talked about some other stuff to end off what we were talking about. And then I zoomed right back in. I'm like, you hold up. I've never heard about this. I've never heard that, you spent time in hospitals and stuff. Tell me more about that. What happened? Well, it turns out you had this major, hip issues, and it spent multiple months in hospitals over the course of multiple years, with surgeries and all kinds of other stuff that he had to go through. And, in a lot of ways it was foundational in him becoming the person he is today, because as a young man, he had to start asking serious questions. He had to start finding out and discerning things from doctors and nurses and people around him to get an understanding of what's going on with him. And ultimately, I think it helped make him the podcaster and the guy that he is today. But in that moment, it was something that he just kind of glossed over. It was just kind of oh yeah, that happened. But once we were able to explore it, not only did I learn something about him as a person, but I kind of learned about, oh yeah, kind of reinforced an idea of man, what we go through when we're younger is formative and will be useful in what we do as we age. But then the other piece for him was he saw it as just kind of this thing. It's just yeah, I had it happen to me. But we had a conversation afterwards. And I'm like, dude, that's a powerful story. You need to share that more. And he has been, which is really cool to see. Because often we don't know what's interesting to other people until people start asking questions. And so as a curious person, I help to, in a sense, shine a light for people on oh, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. And I think the way that you deliver that question matters too. Because if you say, oh, Tell me more about that, right? Am I really that interested, right? Or if I say, oh man, pause, whoop, time out. Tell me more about that little piece right there. What's that about? All of a sudden now we can like raise that energy and interest level of the conversation up, and they can almost, in a sense, feel that connection and like, oh, I didn't realize this was interesting.
You know, there's so much energy in questions. Like Tony Robbins talks a lot about priming, right? You guys both know the idea of priming, getting yourself in a good state as soon as you wake up, putting yourself in a great state before you go to bed. And some of the best conversations I've had, and are you guys familiar with Chris Voss from Never Split the Difference, the ex-FBI negotiator?
Mhm.
Okay, great. Excellent guy. I never met him, but excellent guy based on interviews and everything else. But he has this thing where in the first 3 minutes of every interview, and you can go to every single interview he does, he talks about this as a strategy, but he actually does it and lives it. He compliments the person in the first few minutes. And one thing that I used to do, especially when I was a new coach, early 2020, 2021, I used to start like my coaching sessions and just conversations with, how are you doing? Right? What's new? What's going on? And that's an open-ended question, but it's not a guided question, right? So if you think about the concept of priming, right? Where do a lot of people go generally when you say, what's going on? What's new? What are we thinking about a lot of the times, right? I know this was me and still is me at this stage in my life where I'll think of something that's not the way that I want it is, not the way that I want it to be. I'll think of something that isn't going well, right? Like when you have a customer that walks into a retail store and you say, how are you doing? It's an 80% chance, especially working at a cell phone store like me for years, it's an 80% chance they're going to say, not too good. Hopefully it's better after I talk with you, right? So if you think of priming, that person is immediately starting from a lower vantage point, right? Now it's combat essentially. Okay, now I got to make this person feel better. They're in a bad state. They're thinking about what's not going well. And I would start my coaching sessions with, hey, what's going on? What's new? You know, how's everything going? And people would say, you know, the plan that we talked about, it's not working out too well. The results I'm seeing aren't too great. I'm not feeling too good. I'm tired today. I'm low energy today. The kid woke up in the middle of the night. But then my coach, I started watching what he does when I started working with him in 2021. He would start every single conversation where we talk once a week. He would say, where have you won this week? Let's start there. What are your wins for this week? What's going well? And it would immediately make me think, oh, what are my wins? What went well? And I'd look at my calendar and I'd be like, oh, I had this call. Oh, I did this. We had this event. This initiative worked out. This marketing campaign worked out. This podcast was really cool. And you immediately prime yourself for a different level of thinking because you're coming from a positive place, a place of winning, right? We always have that option of looking at what's great, looking at what's not. When's the last time you've asked yourself, where am I winning in my life? One of my other favorite questions to ask, especially podcasts at the very end, is what are you most excited for right now? What's coming up that you're most excited for? What's a future project that might not even be like concrete right now, but you have an idea for and it brings you excitement? People open up and go crazy about this. I was on a podcast last week, my friend Chase's podcast, the Choo Choo podcast, and he asked me what my goals were for the year. And I was like, oh, I love that question because no one really asks what are your goals for the year, except unless you're working with a coach or something, right? So we love to talk about when things are good, but when we're talking about when things aren't, it puts us in a bad state. Well, what's a question you can ask yourself as soon as you wake up? Maybe it's what we talked about. What am I grateful for? And what about when you go to bed? Right? You're about to hibernate for 8 hours, maybe 4 hours if you're a crazy person like some people, but you're about to hibernate for 4 to 9 hours or whatever your sleeping schedule is. What if you thought about what went well that day before you go to sleep? What if you asked yourself, what have my wins been today? Imagine if you went to bed every single night thinking about what your wins have been. You probably wouldn't have those weird dreams we talked about earlier because you'd be thinking about what you want. Right? Generally, a lot of people say you think about in the morning what you went to bed thinking about. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. Some people do. And Brooke just wrote, oh, that's so good. Asking a guided question at the beginning of a relationship is so smart. It also gives them a chance to share about themselves 100,000%. And not that we're manipulating people or trying to influence people, but we're guiding that person in a positive direction. Right. And as role models, coaches, consultants, mentors, business people, what else is our job? Right. We want to help people feel better, especially if they're buying our product or working with us or whatever it is. So questions allow us to guide them in a positive manner.
Couldn't agree more. And I know personally, so I'm more introverted, and if you open with a question like what's your story or what's your goal for the next year, I'm like strap it. Like I don't know if I want to answer it. But if you can work your way up to more intimidating questions, like what have you accomplished in a little bit? Like what what does a good interview look like for you, or what does let's partner on this. What's your vision for what we're doing here? And then the bigger goals come later on. Tim Ferriss asks this question all the time. He's like, if you had a billboard and the entire world can see it, all races, all genders, all kind of people, what would you put on that billboard? That is not an opening question. That's a closing question. So genuinely curious, asking these questions, especially for like less talky people, just doing the who, what, where, when, why, how before you go into these big visionary questions. Let's actually just play a game real quick to prove how easy this is. This game's going to be how to never run out of things to say. So who wants to be my test subject? All right, Andrew. All right, so Andrew's the test subject. So what's something interesting that you've learned lately? Just give us a short answer.
Sure. I've been listening to the book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and just kind of getting my head around the idea that, so much of story is very, very old. All stories are repeated, and just kind of getting some of the nuance of that.
I know this is random, but it's on my mind. Where do you listen to books? Are you like a gym guy? Are you on a run? Are you at home with the Kindle? Like, where do you like to listen?
Yeah, best opportunity for me is usually taking my kids somewhere. Like if I got to drop my daughter off for something, or if I'm doing dishes. So like for my wife, I'm like, hey, like I'm gonna go do some chores, but like I need your help. Like just don't talk to me while I do it, and I will do chores. And then I'll just kind of plug in and just go to work. Because there's nothing more frustrating than getting into something, getting my groove on, trying to make it better by listening to something, and then being interrupted with questions and having to pause and stop. And I feel like I lose momentum.
I've always been curious, when you get interrupted, how do you navigate that? I'm going to pause. I started with who, what, where. Now we're on when. When you get interrupted, what happens then? When you get interrupted, how do you navigate that?
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of times I have to kind of temper my initial emotion, which is like anger, like, I'm busy. But, often I try to look at the interruption itself. Why is this interruption occurring? And if it's not as important, I'll try to figure out quickly if it's not important and say, hey, can we table this for a little bit and come back later? And then if it is important, then I know to like, okay, let's keep this on pause, or let's totally pull out the headphones so I can fully focus.
Yes. So this is where, and we're going to end this example, but I wanted to show how simple it was just to go through who, what, where, when, why, how. And a question, you mentioned anger. So that's where a time where Ben would probably come in with vulnerability and say like, I might seem chill, Andrew, but I get really angry kind of easily. And I'm curious, like, why do you think that happens, that cool, fun-loving guys? And now we're on to the big level question. Where does anger come from? Why are we angry? We can go deep. We started with very surface level, like, what do? You like to read this kind of book in this location. But I learned that you get kind of angry sometimes when you get interrupted. Now let's take it on to anger. And my point is, if people are curious, how do I never run out of things to say? Just think simple: who, what, where, when, why, how. And that's going to be every single question you're ever going to have to ask anyone, is usually in those categories already. And I feel like I learned this in 4th grade, but I'm just relearning it every single day. Something Andrew knows better than anybody since he quit, a drinking habit, is every day you rinse and repeat. You gotta remember the fundamentals every single day. The who, what, where, when, why, hows. We already talked about this ad nauseum. The follow-up questions that lead to a deeper, more insightful conversation. Does that make sense?
It does. Something just popped into my head I want to share really quick. And I think
Yeah.
because you mentioned the idea of like kind of living it every day, right? And often with addiction, people assume like it's just hard, like it's just this gritty battle and you're just fighting it every day. But it's been really interesting for me. It has not been a struggle. And it's not that I have superpowers or I'm some kind of special person, but it's just, it was an identity shift. And I think once my identity changed and my identity became that of a non-drinker, the answer was always no. There was never any question. There was never any doubt. That's just what it is. And I think we've been talking about curiosity and being a question asker. And a lot of times, sometimes that stems from creativity. A lot of times people, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. I'm not creative. Okay. Or I'm not good at asking questions, or I'm not blank. And I feel like too often we put this blanket statement out there and we handcuff ourselves as far as our abilities. And so I think for my challenge for everyone listening is start thinking of yourself as a curious person. Start thinking of yourself as a good question asker. And you may not be great at those things right now, but you will improve. You will become that person that is excited and that is interested in other people, that does have this kind of thirst for learning and that excitement around it. And it really, I think a lot of these challenges can be solved by an identity shift and by stepping in and owning that identity.
Wow, we got powerful flow going on here.
This is your expertise, Brandon. I want to pass it to you. Talk about the importance of identity shift in these scenarios.
Well,
Jump
the
off
question,
that.
if you then, okay, so if you say, if you want to be a more curious person and you see yourself as a more curious person, then the question comes, how do you become a more curious person? How do you fit the shoes of a more curious person? Well, then you can ask the question, what would a more curious person do in this situation? It's a muscle. It's like anything else. If you're not used to asking questions, if you don't know how to ask questions, you're going to have to start somewhere. And your example, Ben, was a brilliant example of going through the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Like, you didn't even ask Andrew, hey, why are you listening to audiobooks? Like, all you did was you asked him, what's something you learned recently? He could have said anything. Could have been something as his daughter told him, right? But you said, what did you learn recently? And he mentioned audiobook. Well, why might not be one of the first questions or even the first three, but why do you listen to audiobooks? Then he might talk about how he doesn't like reading paperbacks or whatever. But I love that because it always gives you the next place to go. And I think one of the most powerful parts about that was it was a presupposition based on your example. But the matter is that you chose open-ended questions. So there's closed questions and there's open-ended questions. When you listen to a podcast and so let's change the question that Ben asked you originally. When he said, what did you learn recently? And you said, oh, I'm reading this book, Heroes of a Thousand Faces. Ben could have said, oh, do you like it? Do you like that book? Are you learning a lot? And you'd say, yeah, it's good. Right. Unless you're a trained interviewee, and to go deeper, but most people won't do that. So if you ask most people yes or no questions, especially in a sales environment, the answer is always going to be no. Open-ended questions are the key.
Can I say one thing when you I just totally interrupted you, but I like the question, do you like it, as a quick hit, because if he doesn't like it, I don't want to ask, what do you like about that book? What are you learning? This or that. Like, just like, what do you like it? Is it a good book? Yeah, it's good. And they might keep talking, but if they don't, then you ask, what do you like about it? Or what do you do? So I don't think there's anything wrong with those short, quick hit questions, but that's just for a clarity point, that it's almost like a choose your own adventure. Based on the yes or no, you know where to take it. But you do want to do those check-ins. It's the same concept of, does that make sense? Is usually going to get a yes or a no. Same concept. So I do think you want to check in, but then you don't want to end at the check-in and then just start sharing something that has nothing to do with it.
Yeah, they're called feedback questions. When you say, does that make sense? Or do you like that? Right. And then you ask an open-ended question after that. Or you could say, how do you feel about that book? Which isn't positive or negative. It really just leaves the floor open to them. Or when someone talks about something they want to do, oh, how can you do that? What would have to happen in order for that to become a reality? My question for you guys, because you're both amazing at this, especially for someone who does want to become a more curious person, ask great questions and do it in a great way, which takes time and practice. Both of you are really good at this. How do you know I see a lot of people who go from one question to the next. So, Andrew, what have you learned lately? I'm reading this book. How do you like it? Oh, it's really good. What have you learned from it? Oh, this and that. Where do you listen to books? Oh, this and that. Then it's an interrogation, right? When it's question to question to question, it's an interrogation. So how do you avoid it being an interrogation? And how do you turn asking questions into a conversation where both people are providing value?
Yeah, I guess I'll chime in probably first. And I had my first realization of this when I was probably about 20 or 25 episodes deep into my podcast. And I was very much the interrogative interview guy. I had a list of questions and like boom, 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 boom. I remember one lady was super nervous about, being on my podcast and like super interesting topic that we had, but she answered all my questions in like 15 minutes. And like I didn't have any more questions, and then that was the end of the show. Hey, okay, what's a wrap? Okay, crap. And about somewhere around episode 20 or 25, somebody reached out to me and they're like, hey, like, that episode, like you actually like shared a lot of your insights in response to what they were saying, and you had a lot of really interesting things to say. I just wanted to like mention to you, like, make sure like you're sharing stuff too, because you got like really good insight. And just that one comment from somebody that was listening, number one was like, yay, someone's listening. But then number two was like, oh, they're totally right. Because I do think I have interesting things to say, but I often discounted myself because I wasn't as much of an expert. I wasn't as well versed in the thing I was talking to my guest about. But you don't necessarily have to be the best of the best to have something to say. And so for me, I always try and think of, especially depending on the conversation, there's certain amounts that I want to be talking. If I'm in an expert-based conversation and I need to educate someone, I'm going to be talking more. If it's a just getting to know you question, I'm going to be listening a significant amount more. If it's a kind of friendship, we're probably going to aim for a little bit more equal as far as, how much we're sharing. And so, depending on the conversation, I'll share a little bit more. But anytime like I get excited about something, I just can't help it. Like stuff just comes out. I just need to share that. And so when someone says something that really resonates with me, I try and connect with it and bond over it, especially if they're being vulnerable, or especially if they're sharing something that's challenging or interesting or unique or extremely different, or something that may be self-conscious about, right? I always try and bring a little bit of myself in there because that's how we build that relationship. That's how we get to grow together. And that's how because the worst thing to do is, and I made this mistake, was, one guy, after a night of drinking, was like, hey, man, you want to go get a bagel? Sure. Go to a bagel shop. And like, we're just kind of hanging out, sitting there in the sunshine. And dude starts spilling his guts, like just telling me his whole life story and everything that's going on. And then he sits there. He's like, so what's your story? And like, I had no reply for a lot of reasons, but I was so like kind of deep into my challenges that like, I just wasn't aware of my story at all. I wasn't aware of myself. Wow. And like that moment though, I could tell he was like extremely hurt that I didn't now come out and like connect back with him. And so I think, learning kind of the nuance of when someone's kind of putting something out there, and the term you'll hear is a bid for connection. When someone's put something out there in an attempt to connect with you, it's really good to connect back. Even if it's just quickly like, dude, I 100% agree. Like, that sounds terrible. Even if I have nothing to say, that's me having nothing to say. But I've still affirmed, I've still connected. And now if I want to take that a step further and connect further, I'll then try and find a story that I have that may be similar. Or if it's not at all similar, I'll say, hey, listen, this is nowhere near what you were just talking about, but here's my experience. And then I can connect back. And sometimes I'll just ask a follow-up question because it's like, you know what? I just want to keep following this. This is really interesting.
I'm trying.
How about you, Ben? How do you do that? What's the way that you think about it? Because you're a master at doing this.
I don't know if I'm a master. I'm learning, but I'm trying to figure out an acronym for this one. I'm struggling. So I love, and I need another E. We'll get there, but I love the term bid for connection. So I wanted to squeeze that in there. But let me tell you what's kind of going through my head because I'm all over the place right now. So 3 things I'm looking for are emotion, I'm looking for fingerprint, and I'm looking for stories. Now, let me explain. So emotion is, where is there an emotional high, an emotional low? Where can we go deeper on an emotional moment? Give you a really simple example. I didn't know what I was doing. I just came out of my mouth and it ended up going really well. One of my first podcasts, I was talking to someone who was in prison most of his teenage years. And So I asked him, so you're in prison as a child, you get out. How did that feel? And this was a very like fast talking, like powerful alpha male dude. And I kind of asked a soft question with how does it feel? And he went, no one's ever asked me that before. And then he went on a long, long story. But realistically, that's a good question, right? You just been in prison for 5 years. How does it feel to get out? That's the first thing that came to my mind. That's emotion. Fingerprint is what is their fingerprint. You know, mutual friend of, I think all of us, Brian Bogert, at a very young age, had his arm cut off in a horrific accident. That's part of his unique fingerprint. What someone does for a living is a part of their unique fingerprint. Their family, their legacy, their livelihood is part of their unique fingerprint. The way they style their hair. So anything fingerprint related questions, those are great because it's something unique to their own DNA and how they live in this world. So emotional moments, fingerprint, unique, like personal moments, and then stories in there. And I was trying to make an acronym. I don't know if we can get one, but I like story because it's literally as simple as saying, like, tell me a little bit more about that, or talk about why that moment had such a big impact on your life. Now, it depends on the context, but you don't really have to ask anything other than tell me a little bit more. Brandon, talk about a story that where you had this kind of struggle and how you got out of it. As simple as saying, talk a little bit more about that, or why'd you do that, or tell me a story, or really just like, I'm interested. Can you just keep on going? Like, I'm just nodding and listening. You don't have to be eloquent, but just tell me a story. So look for emotion, look for fingerprint moments, and look for opportunities just to probe and say, tell me more. I think it's that simple.
I love that. And even if you know you're going to be talking with someone and it's an important conversation, which really any conversation is important to an extent, knowing those things, as many as possible before the conversation, doing your homework allows you to ask better questions in itself. But Andrew, I know you got to hop off. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I'd say probably closing thought would just circle back to the concept of identity. And if you feel like you're a person that's not a question asker or not good at questions or not naturally curious, start digging into the roots of that and the foundation of that. For me, a lot of the foundation in that is that I don't think I'm that smart. And that's not a negative. It's just there's so much out there. There's so much opportunity to learn. There's so much I don't know. And I know that I don't know very much. And so that's kind of like a core of who I am, as like I'm not the guy that knows everything. But also that allows me to be really endlessly curious. Now it does have some backsides, right? Where, I may not be authoritative or as strong or as like, oh, this is for sure the answer. Sometimes I can be more qualitative and nuanced. But at the same time, for me, it's been a huge boon and asset to me.
Excellent thoughts, brother. Very good stuff. If you got to hop off, do your thing, man. I'll share my last thoughts while you're hopping off there.
Andrew just said he wasn't very smart. What is he talking about?
He's a smart dude. The smartest people always say that too. It's a common theme. I think one thing that I'll end at here is you said it, Ben, and Andrew just talked about it with identity and story. And he said, "What is my story?" Right? And he said it quickly. But when's the last time we've asked ourselves, "What's my story?" And the very interesting thing about story is it's not just about what's happened to you or what you've done. Story is very often invented, right? We create it as we go based on the meaning that we give it. So if my arm was chopped off in my early childhood, like Brian Boger, I've never spoke with Brian, but Brian could have chose several different options. Well, I don't have an arm. There goes 80% of opportunities and physical prowess and all these other things. Or he could say, maybe as he got older and understood these things, hey, this is my unique fingerprint, right? No pun intended. Obviously, he has less fingerprints than the rest of us, but this is my unique fingerprint. And I can use this to tell my story and tell about how I've overcome. So what is your story? How can you craft it in a powerful way that invigorates you, that makes you feel great about what you're doing? And what's the next chapter in that story that you're creating? That would be my final thought.
Love it. And even in that example, it's both. At one point, you might be a victim, and then you got out of victimhood. What a story.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally, man. Well, we're the
Well,
last remaining
Brandon, we could do
survivors
this
here.
all day, man.
Let's just stay another hour and talk. Let's just ask each other questions. All right, dude. This was great. Hey, guys, I hope this was valuable for you. Be sure to check out Ben's next poll that comes out. So it's QR. So R is coming up next after this. So we're gonna think of some words, business, personal related, for you to vote on. Choose the one that you want. We'll speak on that subject. Thanks so much for joining today. We see Larry, Kimberly, Brooke, and whoever else. Thanks for joining, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care, guys.
Peace.